It's Met Monday, and the severe weather threat is going to continue early this week, bringing the threat for all hazards of severe weather, including wind, hail, tornadoes, and flooding. So there is a lot to talk about this week before we have Met Monday tonight with Connor Croft. Make sure that you tune in for that. I hope to see you all there. Without wasting any more time, let's get right into the forecast. Jumping right into our day one categorical outlook, we do have a slight risk in place that is going to be back towards Nebraska, South Dakota, even parts of northwestern Iowa and southwestern Minnesota. And that's going to be including our main tornado threat for the day, which does have a 2% tornado risk. We'll show in just a minute. But that's going to be where our number one concern is for severe weather. There is a majorly wind-driven severe weather threat back towards East Tennessee and especially western North Carolina. That, again, is going to be mostly a wind-driven threat. I wouldn't entirely rule out maybe a spin-up brief weak tornado, but I think it's very, very unlikely that that would happen. But I definitely wouldn't entirely rule it out. We also do have another slight risk in place back through Arkansas and central Oklahoma. That is going to be another one of those wind-driven threats, maybe just a couple of isolated storms. We saw a couple of microbursts out there near Norman, Oklahoma yesterday, so something like that could definitely be possible again today. But our number one concern is going to be back towards Nebraska and South Dakota. Here's that 2% tornado risk that I just mentioned. It's going to include a lot of Nebraska and southeastern South Dakota, so areas like Sioux Falls will be included in this, Thedford, Nebraska as well. So that is going to be the area to watch for any possible tornadic development later on this afternoon and evening out here with these storms while we're doing Met Monday. Damaging winds are going to be the number one concern for today. We do have a 15% that's out towards East Tennessee and through North Carolina, even including slivers of Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia as well, with a larger 5% around it, all the way up through Virginia, West Virginia, parts of Kentucky even. More of Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia as well. So a very large area. And then we have that second region that is going to be out through Oklahoma City back towards Little Rock, Arkansas, where we could get some of those microburst storms like we saw last night that could bring some localized, isolated gusts of damaging winds over short periods of time. And then we have another very large 5% from the Oklahoma Panhandle all the way up through northern Minnesota and even parts of central Montana. So a very large 5% risk where damaging winds are going to be possible. And you'll see in there, co-located with where our main tornado risk is throughout Nebraska and South Dakota, there is going to be that 15% damage. There is going to be that 15% risk for wind damage in there as well. So that'll be one to watch as we go forward into this afternoon and evening. Somewhat steep mid-level lapse rates are going to lead to this 15% hail risk that we do have throughout Nebraska and South Dakota. That's going to be where our hail risk is contained to. We're not really looking at anything back towards the Carolinas or Tennessee, as well as back towards Oklahoma and Arkansas. Nothing to worry about out there in terms of significant hail. But we do have a 15% risk for hail out in Nebraska and southeastern South Dakota. So that's going to be our number one region of concern for hail this evening, where we definitely could see some isolated instances with maybe some larger hailstones on the order of maybe 2 inches or so of hail. But I don't think that we're going to be seeing significantly large hail. I just think that we're probably going to see multiple storms that produce some amount of hail throughout that yellow area there. That is that 15% risk. Tuesday is going to be a little bit more interesting of a setup, and it's going to be largely dependent on what happens today. That's why you're going to see a very large marginal risk and also a pretty large slight risk in place there as well. But I do think that Tuesday's setup could be very interesting and could produce at least a couple of tornadoes as well as some damaging winds without a doubt. So definitely one to watch as you go forward into Tuesday. Here's a look at the 2% risk that is currently in place throughout the quad state region of Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, and Nebraska, including areas like Kansas City, Lincoln, and Omaha. So some pretty populated areas. That's going to be the main area for concern for tornadoes. But tomorrow's setup is going to be a little bit dependent on what happens today. So this region might expand a little bit, or it might shift possibly just to the north. We're going to see how things start to set up as we go forward through Monday here. But if you are doing anything on Tuesday that is in these regions here that are within that pink circle, definitely make sure that you are paying attention to the weather just in case we get a little bit of an uptick in those risks, and definitely make sure that you have multiple ways to receive alerts if you are going to be in those regions. Once again, wind is going to be the primary concern here as we have a very large 5% risk with a smaller 15% risk, but that smaller 15% risk is still going to include a very, very large area, including the majority of Iowa, over half of Nebraska, parts of Kansas, and northern Missouri as well. So a very large area that is included for some risk of severe weather tomorrow that could produce damaging winds. That large 5%, even stretching all the way into Wyoming, parts of Wisconsin and Illinois as well, close to Chicago. So a very, very large area that could see some form of severe weather tomorrow. So definitely make sure that you are prepared for Tuesday evening's threat. You're going to notice that the hail risk is almost identical to that wind risk. It's going to include that large 5% all the way from Wyoming and then back towards western Illinois and western Wisconsin this time. And then that 15% risk that's going to be there for northwestern Missouri, most of Iowa, over half of Nebraska, and the northern parts of Kansas as well. So multiple areas there within that circle that definitely could be seeing damaging hail over a 2-day span. So if you are out there, especially towards like Lincoln and Omaha, Nebraska, maybe even towards Des Moines, Iowa, definitely make sure that you are prepared for a couple of rounds of severe weather that could produce maybe some tornadic action and some hail and wind damage as well over the next 2 days as you go through the beginning part of your week. Looking ahead to the middle of your week on Wednesday, we are going to see a marginal risk that is in place already on your day 3 outlook off the Rockies in eastern Colorado, western Kansas, most of Nebraska as well. I wouldn't be shocked to see this eventually include Cheyenne, Wyoming as well, but there is going to be some threat of severe weather on Wednesday. However, there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding this. So a lot of the weather over the next 2 days is going to kind of shape up what's going to happen over here in Nebraska and eastern Colorado. And that is kind of normal for the summertime. So a lot of issues and details still to be resolved. So make sure that you are ready for Wednesday, just in case something does pop up to become a little bit more significant in those regions. Coming into the timing of our severe weather by 5 p.m., it looks like we're already going to have a bunch of storms out here towards East Tennessee and eventually into the Carolinas towards West Virginia as well. And again, that's 5 p.m. Eastern time. It's going to say 4 p.m. in the top left of your screen. That's Central time, local time for me. Those storms are likely going to be done by around midnight. You're going to see by 1 a.m. here on Tuesday. It looks like all those storms are pretty much done. But as we go back in time a little bit to look towards our main area of concern, towards Nebraska and South Dakota, you're going to see a lot of storms starting to fire off by about 7 p.m. Central time here. These semi-discrete cells are going to pose that risk for some hail for sure. And as they eventually cluster up, it's going to switch to more of a windbag threat here as we get a little bit more of a bowling ball into the AM hours here on Tuesday. And this is exactly why there's a lot of uncertainty for the severe weather setup on Tuesday evening, because recent CAM guidance, which are our convective allowing models, essentially are models that allow for thunderstorm development, those are going to anticipate this system lasting really late into the morning, eventually even into the afternoon. You're going to see 11 a.m. here on Tuesday, and that is going to create some issues in the environment for Tuesday evening. And you're going to notice that the HRRR, at least the 12Z run of the HRRR, doesn't even show really any development happening in this environment out here towards Lincoln or Omaha. And that's going to be where the most favorable conditions are for severe weather, including the intensification of that low-level jet later on in the evening. So I do think that we'll probably get at least 1 or 2 storms that fires off in that area. And any storm that can remain discrete out there will pose a risk for all hazards of severe weather. But it is looking a little bit less and less likely that we will be seeing a more robust storm mode for Tuesday evening as a result of those morning storms lasting all the way into like the early afternoon potentially. So that's going to be one to watch. A lot of uncertainty for Tuesday night. Everything's going to be driven by a very active jet stream into the north towards the Great Lakes as well. You're going to see we do have quite the nice jet streak that is not a very prolific jet streak, but a very large one that is going to stretch all the way from closer to Rapid City and then back through basically Toronto and Detroit area. So a very large jet streak that's going to just increase that upper level flow, and it's going to help out areas, especially Tuesday night, like towards Nebraska and Iowa. So again, that environment will be pretty nice Tuesday evening if we can actually get storms to fire off in that environment. But hopefully the 12Z HRRR is right and we don't actually get storms in that environment, because if any storms can take advantage of it, they could be definitely dangerous. In other news, we do still have a lot of high pressure creating just a very large ridge and just upper level flow that is just maintaining itself throughout the Corn Belt and through the Great Lakes and up towards the Northeast. You're going to see not a lot of upper level support in the South at all. And that is going to maintain those very, very hot conditions down there. So there's a lot of extreme heat advisories and warnings that have been in place over the last handful of days. And that's going to continue throughout this week as well. Areas like from Texas or the desert Southwest all the way back even towards South Carolina are going to be seeing heat index values maybe up above 110 degrees at times. So definitely a significant heat threat there. At about 500 millibars, you can see that ridge much more pronounced here in the mid-levels over the Four Corners states with that high-pressure system at the mid-levels. And again, you can still see there's plenty of high pressure down towards the southeast as well. That's why we're not seeing much of that flow out there. But we're going to see that ridge pattern that is going to continue even through the overnight hours on Monday into Tuesday. So by 4 a.m. on Tuesday, you're going to see a lot of divergence is forecast. And I think that's part of the reason that we're going to be seeing those storms sustaining themselves for a lot longer into the AM hours on Tuesday, because we are going to have some of that mid and upper level support as they continue on in their life cycle, which will limit things for Tuesday evening. But for Monday evening, there's not going to be a ton of added mid-level support, but there is going to be plenty, especially out here towards South Dakota and Nebraska. That is going to be where we're definitely going to be still seeing some of that support that could help things out. But back towards the Carolinas, for example, that mid-level support isn't going to be there quite as much. These storms are not going to be quite as prolific. It's going to be more of a line of thunderstorms driven by that cold front, and those are going to be bringing just mostly damaging winds. But again, we are going to be seeing that upper level flow supporting rising motion out there in Nebraska and South Dakota. That's going to aid in a more standardized storm mode development where you're going to have some of those discrete cells that we saw just a minute ago. That is going to be our number one concern. And that's why we're looking at more of a hail threat and a wind threat, plus that risk for a couple of tornadoes as well. Taking a look at our mixed layer cape, which is a good measure of our instability to overcome the cap, there isn't going to be a ton that is going to be available out towards East Tennessee and the Carolinas, but you don't really need it because you're going to have a lot of added support with that cold front. But as you go back towards Nebraska and South Dakota, you are going to have a lot of cape available, a lot of instability in the mixed layer, which is going to be necessary to overcome that dry air that is going to be entrained, especially towards central and northern South Dakota, which will limit some thunderstorm development. But I do think we'll get some storms able to overcome that cap, as there is going to be plenty of mixed layer cape to overcome that dry air entrainment. You're going to see towards Sioux Falls at around 9 p.m. Central Time here on Monday night. There's going to be a lot of instability forecast. And then as we go forward into Tuesday, afternoon and evening, there is going to be some instability forecast out there as well in our main area of concern. But again, the HRRR, at least the 12Z HRRR, was not showing any actual thunderstorm development there with that, and that was consistent across a couple of other model runs as well. So that'll be something to watch to see if we're actually going to get storm development Tuesday evening or not. As we look at our 0 to 1 kilometer storm relative helicity, I did want to really quickly point out that as we even go forward into the overnight hours on Monday, you're going to see this is 11 p.m. here, where we do have definitely some risk for tornadic development, with that 0 to 1 kilometer storm relative helicity being pretty favorable, especially any areas you see there in yellow. But as we go forward into the overnight hours, I think we're going to have a risk for that nocturnal tornado threat with that residual thunderstorm development, that clustered massive thunderstorms. We could see embedded tornadoes in there. Definitely going to be possible throughout Nebraska, even towards closer to Iowa, and then maybe even towards Kansas City as we get into the morning hours here as we go forward in time. So definitely going to remain something to watch even by 10 a.m. on Tuesday here. If we still have storms going on in southwestern Iowa, like the HRRR is predicting, there is definitely going to be that risk for an embedded tornado within there. So that's why I'm showing this. Definitely something to pay attention to for maybe a little bit of a sneaky, unexpected threat in the overnight hours as we go forward towards closer to Tuesday morning. Looking at our 0 to 6 kilometers here, I'm just going to let this whole GIF play through because I want to point out that in our main area of concern, there's going to be a very favorable sheared environment, even overnight on Tuesday, which is pretty normal in the overnight hours as those surface temperatures cool down and sometimes winds will pick up. But as you go forward into Tuesday evening as well, you're going to see this environment is just very, very well sheared here throughout Nebraska, Iowa, even northern Missouri, northern Kansas, and that's why we're looking at that concern. The environment is very favorable for Tuesday evening, so a lot of uncertainty surrounding the forecast for Tuesday evening pertaining to what's going to happen with those storms that are going to last through the overnight hours tonight, like I've said a million times at this point. But I just want to continue to hammer the point home that if we do get storms that actually fire off Tuesday evening, there is going to be a significant concern or severe weather with any of those storms. Now, I'm not going to bog you down too much with this sounding stuff because I know it can be complicated and confusing to look at, but I just want to point you to the bottom left-hand corner here because those lapse rates are going to be looking pretty favorable here. Everything on the order of the mid 7s, and even at the low levels, we're well above 8. So that's why we are looking at the risk for some of those larger hailstones definitely being possible with those steep mid and low level lapse rates. That's going to be something to watch for those larger hailstones. However, you're going to see there is a lot of dry air at the surface here, just a large gap between your green and your red lines there. That's your dew point and your temperature, basically indicating that we're going to lack a lot of saturation at the low levels, and there's going to be a lot of drier air trapped at the lowest levels of the atmosphere. That's going to limit things off a little bit as well and make it a little harder for storms to fire off and a little harder for them to become surface-based. And that's going to take us to the end of today's forecast, but don't forget to tune in to Met Monday. It's coming tonight. We're going to be talking to Connor Croft about storm chasing and his legendary career at such a young age in his young 20s. Dude's an absolute monster. We're going to be talking about Mikey Plemons' trip to Brazil as well. But also, most importantly, make sure that you have multiple ways to receive severe weather alerts tonight, because we'll be doing the podcast, so we won't be live covering severe weather as a result. But we will be live tomorrow night, which is Tuesday, to cover the severe weather, and we might be live Wednesday night as well. So make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on for that, and make sure that you aren't caught off guard by any of this severe weather. Other than that, stay safe out there, and we'll see you soon.